You want to do it together?
Yeah, let's do it together. This is...
Do it live!
Hold on just a second.
When you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything.
This is Redirect Immigration Law and Perspectives, a weekly dive into the world of immigration law and its human consequences. I'm your host, Stephen Robbins, and I'm joined by Matthew Archambault, my co-host.
That's right. He's lit me on the intro.
Matthew's here on the intro. This week, we're joined by Daniel Denvir. He's a really interesting guy. He did most of the talking, which is how you want it on this particular show. Let me tell you, All-American Nativism is his new book.
Wait, I thought he wrote American Dirt.
No, we're not
gonna do that one.
We could talk about that maybe next week. How the bipartisan war on immigrants explains politics as we know it. It's a really good conversation. But first, Matthew, every week we record, and then after we record, the BIA, the Board of Immigration Appeals, drops some load of hot all over us, and we don't get a chance to talk about it. This week, they did it before we recorded, which is kind of nice.
Yeah, God bless them.
So, matter of J.J. Rodriguez. Now, we've talked about MPP, the Migrant Protection Protocols, which we should not even call it that because that's a load of crap. This is the program that says, oh, you're from some other place in the world. You come to the southern border to seek asylum. You can totally seek asylum, but you need to wait outside of the country, right?
Yeah.
So, this particular individual, Rodriguez, presented himself at the border. He's a Honduran. He said, I want to seek asylum. All the paperwork was processed, and then he was sent back to Mexico and told to show up at a pickup point on a particular day so that Border Patrol could pick him up, drive him to San Diego for his hearing, and then ship him back to Mexico. And allegedly, according to ICE, he didn't show up.
Yep.
So the judge at the hearing says, well, okay, but he's not even able to come to the country. He's only able to go to this pickup point. And I don't have any evidence that he wasn't there. I mean, he's not here, right? But we don't know whether or not he was actually at this pickup point or whatever. There's no affidavits here. We don't know if the car left on time. Like, what if they left 5 minutes early and the guy showed up? We don't know anything. So instead of ordering him deported, which is what happens when somebody doesn't show up to court, the judge terminated proceedings, right?
Yeah.
What does that do, Matthew?
Yeah. It means that he doesn't have an order of removal, but the guy's still stuck. It doesn't give him any status or anything.
Doesn't give him any status. All it means is that if he were to show back up to the border and say like, hey, what the hell, right? He could apply for asylum still.
Mm-hmm.
And he doesn't face the legal consequences of being ordered deported. And the Board of Immigration Appeals says, sorry, bro, you're not allowed to terminate in these particular set of facts. The guy knew about his hearing and he didn't show up. And that's all we need to know. You should have ordered him deported. This is another one of those little Nietzsche kind of technical things that is not going to make major waves in the headlines, but it's such
bull. I mean, listen to this. I mean, I'm sorry. You can edit that out, but I think you should keep that one in. Here's part of the decision. It says the immigration judge expressed concern that the respondent may not have understood the instructions contained in the MPP sheet, but there's no adequate basis to assume that he did not. Both the MPP sheet and the courtesy copy of the MPP sheet, thank you, courtesy, in the Spanish language contain the respondent's signature, and there's no requirement that an alien immigration proceedings be provided with a notice to appear or any other document in their native language.
Nice.
So he got a sheet, may or may not have been in Spanish, may or may not have understood it. The guy's from Guatemala. He may or may not even speak Spanish. He may or may not be literate at all.
Right.
Now, what stops DHS from, let's say, just not picking people up anymore and going in whole scale getting in absentia orders? What stops them? Well, what's going to happen?
And again, there's no like affidavit from a Border Patrol officer saying that they were at the pickup point, that they waited a certain amount of time, whatever. None of that. It's just insane. It's insane. But
give me a break. Life doesn't work that way.
I agree. So it's just unbelievable.
I mean, the immigration judge in this instance is akin to John Roberts at the impeachment hearing. He just sits there. He just has to sit there.
What am I supposed to do now? Oh, deportation. Okay, here's your deportation order. You know, they've really divested the immigration judges of a lot of, and again, like you said, termination. That's not like some incredible benefit. Like,
the guy's not
great.
even in the country.
Now I get my green card.
How can you get ordered deported from a country that you're not in?
Well, that's the other thing. I mean, if normally, that's the other thing. I've got a guy in removal proceedings, and he went back to Mexico before his hearing. So we moved to terminate. We have proof that he's already left. So why would you order him removed in absentia, right? Like, anyways, it's weird. This whole thing is so weird.
He did what they wanted him to do.
Anyhow, let's get to the conversation with Daniel, and we'll talk to you guys next week.
John Roberts.
When you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything.
There's a lot of news to get to, but we're joined today by Daniel. Is it Denvir?
Yes, good guess.
Just like John Denver, but
spelled better.
Let's get into your genealogy. What's up with the IR? What's going on with Denver?
Sounds foreign to me.
I mean, it is in the sense that it's Irish, but there are a lot of different spellings of it. At some point in history, I think it was like Denvier, like DENVI apostrophe ER. And, people really weren't super standard about spelling back then. And that's how somehow, someone sharing my family name has something to do with the city of Denver being named as such. But to clarify, John Denver's actual last name, I believe, is Polish, and he changed it to Denver because Polish Americans were obviously incorporated into whiteness as white ethnics, but the last names have continued to have more of a mark of foreignness. So he jacked a version of my last name to make it big time.
I see. Total sellout, first of all, John Denver. Stay true to your roots. But I guess that's pretty much Hollywood, right? I mean,
it's kind of hard to do a Rocky Mountain High with a Polish last name. Just doesn't fit.
Why?
It just doesn't fit. I don't know. And he made that calculation. He had a very successful career. So who are you to second guess, Stephen?
Well, okay.
I'm just a little bitter. I'm a little sad today.
What's up?
Oh, right. Tell us what's bothering you, Matthew.
John Delaney dropped out.
Oh, I somehow missed that news.
I mean, who else in this field can do as many box jumps as John Delaney? No one. No one. It's not even close. I would say he would probably do twice as many box jumps as the next person.
Tulsi? She's ripped.
Tulsi is right there. Yeah, she's ripped. She does lunges and all kinds of squats and things.
I don't know. Could she bench press Donald Trump? John Delaney could.
Well, okay, but you were specifically talking about box jumps.
I get to move on.
No.
John Delaney's moved on. I can move on too.
If you're going to move...
I'm moving goalposts.
The goalposts. All right. So, yeah, John Delaney... Huge news right before Iowa. That's a real game changer.
He said he didn't want to take votes away from the other candidates.
Actual candidates.
So those 5 people that were going to support him in Iowa, they're now free agents.
Well, who's going to get his coveted endorsement?
I don't know.
Are you sure he didn't say, I didn't want to take vote away? Bold of him to go plural there.
I love John Delaney because he was just this lovable doofus. He's been running for president for the last 5 years. That's all he's been doing.
And what's his deal? Is he rich? Is he a rich guy? He must be, right? I don't know anything about him, to be honest, other than he's
in really good shape.
He's got that P90X vibe going.
He's rich from something medical related, I think, and from Maryland. That's all I know about him.
He's from Maryland?
I thought so.
Well, he's my favorite candidate, and I know nothing about him.
Well, you're the median American voter. Congratulations.
Yeah.
I had a client just the other day. So a lot of times when we confront somebody who's sort of out of options or there are no options. So this was a dreamer, actually, never applied for DACA. He was here with his mom, who's undocumented. And so I kind of got a little politics spiel about how politics might be boring or you might feel like it's over your head or confusing, but it's really important for you to get involved in any way you can, other than voting, obviously. And that this year could be a real important election. And I said Sanders and Warren are kind of the two who have, in my opinion, the most aggressive immigration plans. And the mom says, ¿Qué tal este Michael Bloomberg? What about Michael Bloomberg?
Yeah.
And these are people with all due respect, zero political sophistication or knowledge, but he's flooding the airways with ads and people are asking me about Michael Bloomberg. So
yeah, I think, I mean, at least with Steyer and maybe with Bloomberg too, they seem to poll better in states that the other candidates haven't fully turned their attention to, because literally the pollster is calling and being like, who do you like? And, you know, someone who doesn't have the politics brain disease that the rest of us have is like literally watching TV when the pollster calls and is like, well, I mean, this guy who's talking about Donald Trump on TV right now that I'm watching currently as you're on the phone with me, maybe him.
right.
Do we know anything about Bloomberg and his immigration?
I don't know.
I don't know.
So Tom Steyer just came out with a thing against MPP, the Migrant Protection Protocol, saying that he would end it on like day one. So that's encouraging that he's acknowledging that. So
Sure.
Holly Cooper from there, who's a law professor in that realm, I guess Tom Steyer's helped support their clinic and all that. So he's been doing some good work, I think, for a long time in that regard. So kudos for him. I don't know much else about him, though, I'll be honest.
How about Tom Steyer support my student loans?
Personally,
Yeah.
Personally, let me tell you, I will fully back Tom Steyer, any other Bloomberg. I don't care if you just, I mean, I would sell out for $1 million. Easy. $500,000. If I'm being real, probably like 10K. But anyway, so guys, just real quick, we're going to get to your book, Daniel, I promise. But a couple clips from impeachment real quick. Now, we're going to see what happens today. But the best part,
we already know.
We'll see. The best part about impeachment is that the senators had a chance to get John Roberts to say whatever they wanted him to say. And so we got a couple clips here real quick.
President Trump said that if Russia or China offered information on his opponent, quote, there's nothing wrong with listening, end quote, and he might not alert the FBI because, quote, give me a break. Life doesn't work that way.
So I've got that now on my drop board.
Break. Life doesn't work that way. Give me a break. Life doesn't work that way.
And then the last one is from Kamala Harris.
The question from Senator Harris is for the House managers. President Nixon said, quote, when the president does it, that means that it is not illegal, end quote. Before he was elected, President Trump said, quote, when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything, end quote.
Well, we know what that quote.
When you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything.
I wish they would have gone with the full quote there.
Yeah. What is the point of having the Chief Justice there? Like, seriously, why didn't they get like Alex Trebek? Someone who has like experience like reading note cards.
Pat Sajak.
Pat Sajak would have been good.
Yeah. He's just calling balls and strikes, okay? Just calling balls and strikes. Yeah, I don't know the point of a judge in a proceeding where both sides are allowed to just, and one side in particular, like make things up and lie. It seems weird, but
when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything.
Like, what kind of format is this? So, seriously, like, let's ask softball questions of our side.
Mm-hmm.
And so they can give a little, like, 2-minute political speech. Each side is doing it. No side is really being tested. Like, it would be better if they just had the two sides, like the two attorneys, just go back and forth and ask each other questions. I mean, Pam Bondi gets up there and completely lies about the whole Joe Biden, the Ukraine was involved in this investigation of Burisma, which has no facts whatsoever to support it. They just make up, and that's it.
Balls and strikes, like, Matthew. Just balls.
Balls.
So
that's for sure.
Well, legal realists might like this setup because it demonstrates that at the end of the day, the law does, come down to raw political power, despite all of the trappings of due process and impartiality. Here it is in the Senate with just John Roberts presiding over a circus. Maybe it's kind of fitting.
Right.
Isn't presiding like in the least context that you can ever say? I mean, seriously, when I was listening to you guys talk at the beginning, that was like the equivalent of what John Roberts was doing.
Like, real talk, if they went out and swapped him out with like a homeless guy with a third grade education, you wouldn't necessarily know.
They should have had Louis Gohmert. He was a judge.
That's right.
That would have been entertaining.
Now, Daniel, you wrote a book. How was that? Fun?
No, I don't want to do it again. It took 3 years. I'm really happy with how it turned out. Like, preparing to do interviews and book talks and whatnot, I reread portions of it and was surprised to like my own book. But the actual experience of writing it was difficult and unpleasant. And doing it on top of my day job it got weird. By the end, it got weird. I was going to sleep at 3 a.m. and then waking up at noon and starting again for the last few months. It was weird.
And the book is called All-American Nativism, How the Bipartisan War on Immigrants Explains Politics as We Know It. Now, your book goes back about 40 years as sort of the starting point. And I'm curious how you chose that, because it seems to me, I know there's this idea that things took a turn for the worse for immigrants when the neoliberals came into power in the 1970s or so. But it seems like you could almost choose any starting point in American history and be right about things being terrible for immigrants.
Yeah. And I mean, you can go all the way back to the first naturalization law passed very early in this country's history, soon after the Revolution, which defined naturalization as being open to free white people, or throughout the 19th century with state laws in Massachusetts, in particular, targeting Irish paupers, or the fact that immigration policy in the 19th century, in a large sense, wasn't even really thought of as such, but was really a settlement policy about recruiting white settlers to hold land that was being dispossessed from indigenous people across the expanding Western frontier, or, starting in 1882 with the Chinese Exclusion Act, and then other Asians being banned over the following decades. And then the 1920s, the national origins quotas laws passed amidst the first Red Scare and eugenics and all of that, restricting immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. So I do provide kind of a capsule history of that longer history, but I think that 1965 is an important date because that's the repeal of the National Origins Quota Act, the Hart-Celler Act, when the country's immigration laws become facially, racially neutral. But at the same time, beginning in 1965 and then again in 1976, the avenues for legal Mexican migration are cut off. And there's this pre-existing labor migration from Mexico established in large part by the Bracero guest worker program. And so you have a massive network and system of Mexican labor migration in place, which is suddenly declared illegal. So that's an important turning point. And that happens, of course, as business and the right, and eventually New Democrats as well, lead a successful assault on the whole New Deal order, implementing the rise of neoliberalism. The economy is becoming a lot more uncertain for many Americans and very unequal. And so you have the illegalization of Mexican immigration at the same time as the economy is being restructured in this way that's incredibly damaging to so many people. And the confluence of those two things is a perfect storm for decades of racist scapegoating and hysteria.
Do you have a sense of whether the idea was these jobs will actually be picked up by white people as long as the brown people aren't here, the agricultural jobs and whatnot, or if it was the underlying intent to continue to take advantage of the same labor pool, but just now lacking lawful status?
I think the intents were contradictory. Business wanted to maintain access to low-wage immigrant labor. Of course, they were at various points happy to exploit undocumented workers whose labor was cheapened by the fact that it was illegal, that they didn't have recourse to often the protection of unions and certainly not the full protection of labor laws because they lived in fear of being deported, but they also wanted guest worker programs. And they also often want their workers to be legalized so that they don't have to deal with the legal risk of employing undocumented immigrants. But then in terms of the hardcore organized nativists, they're motivated by racist and nationalist concerns that the country's WASP majority is under attack because of demographic change. But then what's the role of establishment political figures like Bill Clinton or California Governor Pete Wilson? That's more of a political calculation that they're making that I don't think really has to do in this narrow way with serving business interests, but more serving the interests of the system that business benefits from, scapegoating immigrants for the ills of the neoliberal system. And in terms of that, there's one memo from Rahm Emanuel, who was an advisor to Bill Clinton at the time, which really sticks out, where he basically makes it clear that that's precisely what they wanted to do. He writes in 1996, "We should be honest that if we want continued public support for trade and friendly relations with Mexico, we must be vigilant in our effort to curb illegal trade, e.g., narcotics and immigrants." So in that case, it's a very clear strategy to redirect people's anxieties about the globalizing economy and about the role of the U.S. post-Cold War when it suddenly lacks this foundational enemy, to redirect that against immigrants and onto the border.
So why is it that illegal drug trade and narcotic trade is always conflated with unlawful immigration? And why isn't it better conflated with things like regular trade, as most of the illegal drugs come in through containers, right? And through ports of entry. Here in Philadelphia, we just had a huge drug bust coming in through a container in the port of Philadelphia. It always strikes me as like they say illegal immigration, just in order to kind of like make it sound more appealing to people. They say also we're fighting illegal immigration in the illegal drug trade, like they're necessarily tied hand in hand. I mean, some people might say it's because of racism, but maybe you have a different take, Daniel.
No, I think racism plays a big role. If we look back to yeah, correct. If we look back to the 1990s, there's all this concern around NAFTA about jobs going south and drugs coming north. And indeed, NAFTA is perceived as something that will be allowed to facilitate drug trafficking because there's more cross-border trade to hide drugs in. And so it's useful politically to blame the racialized other drug dealer, whether the Latin American trafficker or the Black inner city drug dealer, for these problems, and respond to it with the same way that mass incarceration and policing did, in a huge way in the 90s, which is that if we just crack down hard enough, it'll stop that. And that's not what happens at all. Indeed, U.S. drug interdiction policy consistently makes the drug problem worse over the years. It's perverse.
Yeah. Trump is... Do you remember the whole thing about we have to have see-through walls because they're catapulting bags of drugs over the wall? Do you remember this?
Yeah, that was weird. I guess someone said it to him and then he repeated it.
Right.
A few times, though.
Yeah, multiple times.
And why hasn't that happened? I mean, I might support a transparent wall. Seriously, like made of like the fiberglass they use for the backboard for basketball. That could be kind of cool.
Okay. Anyways.
You agree with me. You know you agree.
Drugs are coming over in trucks. They're paying bribes to Border Patrol. It's all very sophisticated. It's not catapults or dreamers carrying over 75-pound bags of marijuana. But you're right. It's been an interesting strategy to sort of reshift the focus onto vulnerable people.
Yeah. And this goes back, this historian Matthew Lasseter has written a bit about this in terms of it's not only the construction of these racialized others as the dangerous drug dealers, but the flip side of that as well, which is the innocent white suburbanite who's the target of these drug dealers. The same logic that says that the government can unleash massive repression through police and the DEA and support for the Mexican military or whatever to finally stamp out the drug problem is also the one that animates all of this resistance to housing integration and school integration in these suburban communities where the demands for the drug war in the mid-20th century really take off.
Right. I want to ask you about the wall, because I remember in the general election of 2016, we would play a clip of Hillary Clinton in her very sort of Ivy League way saying that she was for barriers, and that didn't seem to attract any sort of ire or attention. On the other hand, a sort of build that wall chant can send shivers down one's spine. Where did this idea come from, and how is it that, on the one hand, we became so comfortable with the idea when it was said a certain way?
Yeah, I mean, I guess a big silver lining of Trump's presidency is that he's attached his toxic brand to these policies that were for a long time really seen as normal and moderate and reasonable. The Secure Fence Act of 2006, which Hillary Clinton voted for, Joe Biden voted for, Barack Obama voted for and was signed into law by George W. Bush, which led to the construction of hundreds of miles of border fencing that, as I'm sure you guys know, in a lot of places, like if you go down to the Tijuana San Diego border looks a lot like what Trump might call a wall. It was seen as the way to seal this country from undocumented immigrants and drugs. And that, like, in the early 1990s, we had almost no fencing on the border. Today, we have more than 650 miles. We had, I think, around 3,000 Border Patrol agents. Today, we have nearly 20,000. And there's been this dynamic going on where border security has become this political theater where politicians say, okay, this new crackdown, this new infusion of border agents, these few hundred more miles of fencing, that will finally secure the border. But what they're really saying to the American people is this will finally make your lives more secure. And it does neither of these things. It neither stops undocumented immigration or drugs or makes people's lives more secure. So when the performance fails, they never re-examine the fundamental assumptions underlying the whole strategy. Instead, they just double down and try more extreme measures. And so the whole debate, the whole Overton window on border security moves so far to the extreme right that Donald Trump's literal hermetic sealing of the nation with a wall-to-wall border is really the only thing left. But it's so extreme and expressed in such brazenly racist language that it no longer wins the bipartisan support that it did for decades.
Right.
You're right. It pushes the argument so far to the right. So anything that is not a sea to shine and sea wall sounds progressive. And this is why I think people who actually say they care about immigrants lose out, because almost every candidate or politician will say, well, of course I'm for border security. Like, of course, you know, and so few of them actually can define what they mean. Like when I say, like, oh, I'm for open borders, oh, well, you can't talk about open borders. That's ridiculous. I mean, what was ridiculous before Trump began running, as you're saying, Daniel, was this huge, gigantic wall idea. People would mock it. But now it's like, okay, well, maybe not the whole thing, but it's considered a reasonable idea that needs to be debated.
Yeah, and it's true that many Democrats are still playing into the basic framework of border security, which is a problem because it's a framework that the anti-immigrant right owns. It's like the argument made by George Lakoff around, you know, don't think of an elephant, don't use the right's frameworks to debate the right, or the right will win. And George Lakoff wrote about this whole dynamic around border security in the aughts and wrote that the narrow framing of the immigration debate as a border security question has fundamentally shaped its politics by legitimating the idea that border insecurity is a problem. It then makes border security the solution. And then when you're operating within that framework, well, who's offering the toughest solution? It's the wall. And unfortunately, we saw Democrats, including Nancy Pelosi and James Clyburn, fall into this when Trump was shutting down the government to try to get his wall funding. You know, Pelosi criticized Trump on these technocratic grounds, saying Democrats are committed to border security. The problem with the wall, she had this technocratic critique of it, that it wasn't the smart way to do it. She said we should have, quote, evidence-based knowledge about how we best secure our border. And then James Clyburn said, you know, maybe a smart wall would be better, which is not really a persuasive argument against the against Trump's
drones
agenda.
in Siri, basically. I'm just like, we've played this clip a lot before. There was a debate in 1980 between George Bush padre and Ronald Reagan. And this guy asks about educating illegals in public schools, which was a case that was later decided by the Supreme Court in, I'm trying to remember the name of that case.
Pilar v. Doe.
Pilar v. Doe.
Yeah. So it was hot in the minds of everybody around that time. And the question is framed sort of in a Trumpy way, like, why should my tax dollars have to pay for these illegals in the public schools? And both candidates responded in an intellectual way by pointing out, look, we're going to have immigration from south of the border as long as unemployment in Mexico is at 50%. And also, like, in a humanitarian way, urging the audience member to remember the humanity of these people. And then Reagan went on to sign a major amnesty bill. And I'm just wondering, why you think that degree of humanity was lost, specifically in the Republican Party, and whether that was driven by the voters or by the politicians.
Well, I mean, just a side note on IRCA, the politics of IRCA are very weird and hard to understand from where we sit today because it kind of flips the dynamics around the comprehensive immigration reform debates of the last 2 decades on their head. It was initially groups like FAIR, the Federation for American Immigration Reform, anti-immigrant groups that were pushing it because they saw employer sanctions as a good way to end undocumented immigration. And so you had groups like MALDEF and NCLR initially opposing IRCA because they were not initially so impressed by the legalization provisions. They were scared of and opposed the employer sanctions. But that's not how it played out. The legalization was very successful, in part because immigrant rights lawyers like yourselves did a very good job getting people registered under IRCA and legalized. And the employer sanctions did not work as fair, I think fair. The one thing I'll give them credit for, as they fairly note, they did not work as FAIR intended them. But that really sets the stage for the 1990s when the anti-immigrant movement, as we know it today, exploded in California around Proposition 187. FAIR and all these groups had spent the 80s really trying to make immigration and anti-immigrant politics a live issue in American politics. And they reasonably thought they could do so because polling showed that there was a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment, but it still hadn't really taken off. So in the 80s, they really focused on pushing English-only referenda and laws, including one that passed in San Francisco, another that passed statewide in California. And that was a pretty savvy move because you could both appeal to the more open racists who saw it for what it was, as something that was anti-immigrant and against the people who were speaking a different language. But they also appealed to people within this kind of liberal nation of immigrants ideology by saying, this is about incorporating immigrants in this country. And we're kind of balkanizing the country and ghettoizing these people by not encouraging them to speak English. And so that's their gambit in the 80s, and it's fairly successful. And then we get to the 90s, and there's a recession in California after the Cold War has drawn to an end. The aerospace industry has taken a dive. There's an economic slump. And that's when the anti-immigrant movement really explodes. And it explodes specifically around the crisis at the border, which is a crisis manufactured by the US government illegalizing Mexican immigration, as we discussed before. So suddenly you have the scene of all of these people in San Isidro, at one of the top places for unauthorized border crossing, just huge numbers of people kind of surging past Border Patrol agents. And that book is all over the news. You have that factor. And then you have the right very successfully blaming immigrants for the economic crisis. And so Proposition 187, what it does is denies social services to undocumented immigrants, including public schools. So this whole politics of the 1990s around this anti-welfare politics, I think many of your listeners know that it was built around the pathologization of the Black welfare mother as this non-working, parasitical, dependent, feeding off of the resources of hardworking, tax-paying citizens. But it was also very much about a similar pathologization of immigrant women for using welfare. So you have Mexicans who are brought here by the US government through the Bracero program, who are simultaneously and somewhat contradictorily framed as such hard workers that they'll undercut everyone else's wages, but also lazy welfare layabouts. I found this article. There was a Republican legislator from an LA suburb around the time who circulated this ditty composed by a constituent. Everything is mucho good. Soon we own the neighborhood. We have a hobby. It's called breeding. Welfare pay for baby feeding. And so it's this idea that the welfare state is funding the literal reproduction of racialized threats to the hardworking, tax-paying citizen. And that becomes just a major feature of Republican and New Democratic politics in the 1990s. And we can talk more about that too, but that's kind of the basic setup.
Okay, so that's super depressing.
So that Congress, that person was from California, one of those leftist, left coast elites. We need more heartland values, right. I think Stephen would agree, right?
Right. Well, it's interesting what you're talking about because we saw the Supreme Court lift an injunction on Trump's sort of steroid-injected public charge rules. And you're seeing a lot of reports that talk about Trump's public charge rules. And to be sure, they're different. And it is going to make my life in particular a living hell. And that's what matters the most here, is how it affects Matthew and I.
Exactly. Thank you.
It is a change, but it's also not, right? I mean, it's also not really that radical a departure from these things that you're talking about.
So the public charge rule, in very short, is designed to ensure that the immigrant who's going to become a permanent resident or come to this country will be taken care of, and they won't have to go on use public welfare or support. What Trump's rule is going to make it a lot more difficult, put a lot more discretion in the hands of the USCIS officer. But already, I mean, I've had many clients over the years where it was the immigrant keeping the U.S. citizen from going on public welfare, keeping the U.S. citizen and the U.S. citizen's children from having to collect food stamps. But because the U.S. citizen didn't work, they couldn't be the sponsor. They couldn't do the affidavit of support. Now, the immigrant worked, but they worked unlawfully, so we couldn't use that as a calculus. So it's one of these laws that they put in with seemingly neutral effect, but it's going to be really devastating. And like me and Stephen, I'm actually doing this podcast from under my desk where I've been hiding since the injunction was lifted. So
yeah, it's devastating. And like so many things with Trump, it's both monstrously cruel in new ways, but also deeply rooted in the seemingly normal things that came before him. I mean, the public charge rule dates to 1882, the Immigration Act of 1882, which is the first comprehensive federal immigration law. And that in turn is based on state laws like those of Massachusetts that targeted Irish paupers. What I find really revealing about the public charge rule is there's been this debate since Trump took office is like, is it racism or is it economics? And I always think that this really is a reminder that that question was always incorrectly posed because it's inextricably both. Because what we see from the history is that Mexicans are painted as a racialized other because of their economic role within U.S. capitalism. But then with this public charge rule, we have a supposedly economically and class-oriented policy that's facially racially neutral being imposed to target people for definitely racist reasons.
Right. So let me ask you, because we're obviously now like on the precipice of like full-on fascism and maybe not having an election, and that keeps me up at night. And I think with Trump, there has been sometimes a tendency to both sides immigration specifically and to point out the failures of the Obama administration, which we've done on this show, including before the Trump election. Sometimes I think it's
we
done.
were the first.
We were the first, actually. We did it more.
People are talking about it more and more, though.
Exactly. We came out very strongly against it. But sometimes it's done as almost like I liked the Clash before they were popular. And sometimes it's done, I think, in good faith. And I guess my question for you is, why does this matter? Or what do we do with this information moving forward?
I think that's a good question. And I think the reason you're asking it is because my book could alternatively be titled Trump, Obama, Bush, and Clinton Did It. But the point of that is not whataboutism, but really to understand that if we want to both undo the politics and the policies that have made Trump possible, then we have to do more than defeating Trump. Like, I think there's something revealing about when Trump started the family separations and John Favreau tweeted a photo of a Central American child or two children lying down in a cage and was like, look at this monstrosity. And it's like, well, it is monstrous. But it turned out, embarrassingly for John Favreau, that the photo was from the Obama administration when he was detaining Central Americans at the border. Obviously, mostly he was trying to detain families together rather than separate them, but still, as you both know very well, in utterly deplorable conditions and in a way that fundamentally denied their right to seek asylum.
Frankly, if I'm going to be detained, I don't want it to be with my family.
Yeah.
That's a bad joke.
That is a bad joke because your mom's a lovely person, Stephen.
Okay.
I love my mother, but that's neither here nor there.
Anyhow, okay, sorry. You're right.
The rhetoric that Trump uses, it's drawing off of a history of that rhetoric being normalized by his bipartisan predecessors. I mean, Bill Clinton in 1995 said, our nation was built by immigrants, but we won't tolerate immigration by people whose first act is to break the law as they enter our country. So this idea that there's an inherent criminality to undocumented immigrants created by the unauthorized border crossing was something established by his predecessors. Same with the idea that they're criminal threats. Same with the idea that they're terrorist threats after 9/11. And then you look at the raw kind of institutions and laws that Trump is using to carry out his agenda. Well, family separations, that was done because of a zero tolerance policy on prosecuting unauthorized entry, which is something that has been on the books since the 1920s, but that really took off under George W. Bush and Barack Obama. A good thing to look at is the connection between the mass deportation system and the criminal justice system, which is really powerfully put in place under Bill Clinton with IRA, which ultimately has the statute 287G, which is picked up under Bush and deputizes law enforcement all over the country as ICE agents, including people like Joe Arpaio, or Secure Communities, which merges local law enforcement fingerprint databases that went to the FBI with those of ICE, so that anyone picked up anywhere in this country by law enforcement, which is a lot of people because we live under this monstrous mass incarceration system that makes it more difficult than not to avoid coming into contact with the criminal justice system, makes every one of those interactions a front door into deportation pipeline. And those two things, 287G and Secure Communities, are Obama's core immigration enforcement programs. He only curtails them thanks to massive protests from the immigrant rights movement that erupts under his presidency. And that's where these sanctuary cities come from, are resisting Obama's deportation policies and the connection that they have with the criminal justice system. And then Obama curbs them. And then Trump goes out on the campaign trail is like, 287G and Secure Communities, great programs. We're going to bring them back. And he literally makes Obama's deportation program his own.
Right.
Well, I think why it's necessary to talk about it, and I am cautious because one thing when you bring up Obama and Clinton, and then you'll get these right wingers who will be like, yeah, they did it too, and this kind of whataboutism, but they're not being critical. It's just a way to like own the libs. But I think it's important because I think if we have an election and a Democrat wins and takes office, that we should all be vigilant to celebrate Trump losing. And then after the day after we're done celebrating, to say to the next president, you're on notice. We understand the bullshit that you guys play. Right. And we're not here for it anymore. Because immigration is going to play such a vital part of this campaign. If a Democrat is able to win, I don't think there's any way they can ignore the role that the immigrant rights community would have in their victory. So if Bernie Sanders becomes president and he has this great plan out there, I think it's incumbent on all of us to say, Bernie, congratulations, but we're watching your ass. And you're not going to be able to get away with, okay, well, I'm going to get to it. Right. It's done. You better get to it, or else you're going to have some angry people right up your ass. And I really hope that people that support whoever becomes president, their core supporters, understands that. Because going after Obama, it did come at a cost for a lot of people. A lot of people were really shunned because they had the audacity to speak against Obama. And I think us in the immigrants' rights community have to understand that even if our preferred candidate gets there, that we need to hold them to task.
Right. And Daniel, I got to say, I think your book is really valuable because, well, for a lot of reasons, but a lot of Americans have an idea that racism is the N-word. And if you say it, you're a racist. And if you don't, then you're not. And with immigration, there's this whole thing about like, well, you're breaking the law. So I'm colorblind. It just has to do with the legality of the thing. And I think your book does a really good job of laying out sort of the racist underpinnings of the whole system and how we got to where we are. So thanks for writing it. And thanks for coming on the show too.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm a fan of your podcast.
Oh, well, that's
That does not say much about you. I'm sorry.
all right. Anything else you guys want to talk about?
I just wanted to respond to the point made a few minutes ago about I think we can do both oppose Trump and the system that gave rise to him, and that we're seeing that we can do it both in the primary. Last year, when everyone or almost everyone on the Democratic primary stage, I don't remember exactly who didn't raise their hand, but most people raised their hand to the question of, would you decriminalize unauthorized border crossing? That was huge. And that's an utterly different world from where mainstream Democratic politics were at 4 years ago, let alone 8 or 12 years ago.
So, well, here's something, Daniel. Let's go out 20, 40 years from now. When they look back, who do you think would have the biggest negative impact on immigration, obviously from our perspective, Bill Clinton or Donald Trump?
I'm going to have to say Bill Clinton, because just as Margaret Thatcher supposedly, when asked what her greatest achievement was, she said Tony Blair. The same could be said true generally with Bill Clinton in terms of the triumph of neoliberalism being consolidated by the supposedly Social Democratic Party signing on to it in the full-throated way that he did. That was true here, and it was true in the UK. And I think the same also holds true on immigration, where the bipartisan consensus, which was enabled by the Democrats' eager participation in the war on immigrants, is what has made it so dangerous, because it made it so normal. If we'd been dealing with decades of conflict between the two major parties over immigration, we wouldn't have so many deportations, so much border wall, so many border patrol agents, so much racist stigmatization of immigrants. And I was reading an LA Times article researching my book about Proposition 187, and it said that it was Dianne Feinstein, then and now the Democratic senator from California, who first made border security an issue and sort of gave permission for Republicans in the state to make it an issue as well. And so even though she opposed Proposition 187, as Bill Clinton did, the Clinton administration rolled out Operation Gatekeeper, the huge crackdown militarization of the San Diego border, just before the vote. Dianne Feinstein on the ballot that year, even though she opposed Proposition 187, had an ad where she boasted that she, quote, led the fight to stop illegal immigration. So I really am going to have to say that history will judge Bill Clinton harshly on this, because it was the bipartisan consensus that made the bipartisan war possible. And, you know, a lot of like normie political scientists are always fretting about polarization, but polarization on immigration is a good thing because there's no longer on the ground a bipartisan basis for it. It's shocking given that Trump's in the White House, but polls show that Americans hold possibly the most pro-immigrant beliefs in the history of this country. And that's a good thing. Democratic elected officials haven't caught up yet, but they're beginning to, I hope. And it's up to the immigrant rights movement and movements in general to make that happen.
Yeah, I mean, what I see with Bill Clinton is we have a statute. He was able to pass IRA, and Trump has basically passed policies. So it's going to be a lot easier to undo what Trump has done. And obviously, we haven't been able to undo what Bill Clinton has done. So I'm going to go with Clinton, and hopefully that answer holds true, that Trump doesn't figure out how to pass statutes and make stuff even more permanent. So,
well, ironically, one reason he can't pass statutes is because there are people in his administration like Stephen Miller who come out of the John Tanton network anti-immigrant world who see the wall as a bit of a side show. And what they really want, of course, are deep cuts to legal immigration, because most immigrants in this country are here legally. But the problem is there's no mass movement to support on the ground or in Congress cuts to legal immigration. And that goes back to the 90s, too, because IRA was initially legislation to both crack down on undocumented immigrants and to cut legal immigration. But the bills were split, and the war against immigrants became very much a war against, quote, illegal immigrants. And for the nativist movement, that was supposed to be a means to the end of ultimately shutting down basically legal immigration. But the means have become an end in themselves. So if you talk to like many anti-immigrant people, Trump supporters or whatever, and you say, why are you anti-immigrant? They will respond, I'm not anti-immigrant. I just want people to come the right way and to get in line like everyone else. So their strategy has really screwed them. because they have defined the problem as one of illegal immigration. And now the nativist movement, with the most nativist president perhaps in American history, can't get the legal immigration cuts that it's always been fighting for. It's kind of a sweet irony. I mean, the public charge rule is one way to get at it, and they're going to make a lot of people's lives hell. But as you point out, that can be reversed by the next president, and I expect that it will be.
Well, from your lips to God's ears, Daniel Denvir, the book is All-American Nativism. People should check it out and buy it wherever books are sold. But not on Amazon, right? I mean, that's not good.
Yeah, I anticipate some of my readers are buying it there, but I am studiously not encouraging that by name.
Okay, got it. Well, thanks again for your time, and we appreciate you coming on.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.